Welcome to the Freeborn Podcast. My name is Mike Jackson. Before we get started today, I want to tell you who we have coming on for the weekend podcast, which is this Saturday at 9 a.m. We're going to have Brett Carpenter. He's been on before, but we're going to have him back on because he has spent the last 6 or 7 years intensely studying the rapture and the second coming out of the scriptures. And so we're going to have him on to discuss the research that he's done and some of the conclusions that he's come to. So if you're interested in that topic, I think you'll find this very interesting. He's done a tremendous amount of research into this. He's done a tremendous amount of study, and he has some very interesting points that he'll be discussing with us. And pretty much everybody's interested in that topic for the most part. I'm probably one of the few people that's not naturally interested in the topic of the rapture. I'm not a prophecy buff, if you want to call it that. I'm not real big into studying prophecy. I don't know a lot about it, but I am interested in his research because of the amount of time he's put into it. So I hope you'll join us. That'll be this Saturday at 9 a.m. here on the Freeborn Podcast. You can catch us live on YouTube, and then you can also find the recorded past episodes on YouTube as well if you go to youtube.com/freebornchurch. And we're also on iTunes and Spotify and Google Play as podcasts. We put up the audio. So if you're interested in listening to the podcast in audio version only, you can get it through there. YouTube is becoming increasingly censoring the content like ours. We've actually had a couple of times now that they have pulled our content, that they have banned a stream or taken a stream down. And so it's difficult sometimes to find content that is not in line with the mainstream narrative on YouTube. And so in those cases, you can find, even if YouTube pulls the stream down, we are recording these also as audio format, and we will upload them to the audio platform. So I'd encourage all of you to look into your podcast app that's on your phone or on your computer, and from there you can search for Freeborn Church or Freeborn Podcast also, and you should be able to find our site and our page or our channel of our podcasting channel where all the audio is uploaded. And with that also, you're able to listen to it while you're driving, or if you don't want to consume a lot of energy on your phone or data, well then that's a lot more efficient way of listening to the podcast, even though you don't get the video. So anyway, Saturday at 9 a.m. we'll be here with Brett Carpenter. Of course, it'll be a virtual podcast. He's not able to be in studio. He lives in Indiana. However, we will have him there for that. And then we have guests lined up all the way through the month of July right now. And we are pursuing other interviews as well, trying to bring in the content that we ourselves find interesting, and I hope you will also. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the idea or the issue of collectivism. We are titling this episode, "The Siren Song of Collectivism." Collectivism is an ideology. It is a paradigm that is predominant in socialistic societies, whether they be whether it be pursued principally along a financial dimension or a social dimension. But the idea of socialism is largely built upon the concept of collectivism, which is where you identify as the group to which you belong and not principally as the individual that you are. The American independence and the American system has largely been founded on the concept of individuality, that it is the individual that matters. And Western culture really brought this idea to fruition, really brought it to maturity. If they didn't basically invent it themselves, but they at least brought it into full-fledged maturity. And Western civilization is founded on the concept of the individual. However, it's nearly impossible, from what I can tell, for human beings to not identify to some extent along a collective dimension or along a collective line. And that's because, well, there's a number of reasons why. We all have a desire for relationship. We have a desire for unity, for grouping up. None of us want to live alone. None of us want to be lonely. And so in order to exist in a community, in order to exist with other people, well, it's imperative to share some values with them. And that's what Western society has typically done, or I should say in Western society, this community experience is based or is founded on or centered around our values as a, how would I put it? It's a bit. Welcome to the Freeborn Podcast. I'm Mike Jackson. Before we get started today, I want to let you know what we have going on for Saturday, the Saturday morning podcast. Saturday at 9 a.m. on our live broadcast, we are going to feature Brett Carpenter. He's been a guest already once on our podcast before, but this time we're going to talk to him about his extensive research into the subject of the rapture and the second coming. He's been studying this out of the scriptures concertedly for 6 or 7 years. And so we're going to be looking in with him and seeing what conclusions or what answers he can afford us on this subject. I know this is a subject that many people are interested in. It's a subject that's very compelling for a number of people. Full disclosure, me, myself, I'm not that concerned or that interested in the rapture or in the second coming, but I'm very interested in the study he's done on it. So I guess I should say that I'm not interested in studying it out myself. It's not a topic that draws me or compels me to want to really spend a lot of time researching it, but it does him. And so I am interested in seeing what conclusions he's come to, what information he can offer us, and how he's analyzing these texts. And so that's this Saturday at 9 a.m. We're going to be talking to Brett Carpenter about the rapture. So I hope you'll join us. You can find this podcast both on YouTube through in video format, where we broadcast it live, and then you can also look at the past episodes. And you can find our channel on YouTube by going to youtube.com/freebornchurch. youtube.com/freebornchurch, and that'll put you on our channel. And we have a lot of videos there, including our Sunday sermons, videos that I make every now and then on particular subjects, scripted videos. And then we have these podcast videos, both with me just talking to you through the camera. And then on Saturdays, we try to have someone in to interview them and talk to them about different topics. And so you can find all of that on our channel. You can also find it on the podcast apps or the podcast platforms like iTunes and Spotify and Google Play. Those are the 3 that we're on. And you can find us there by searching for Freeborn Podcast or Freeborn Church. And you can then listen to the audio version of the podcast. So today, this episode, we are calling it the Siren Song of Collectivism. And I want to talk to you a little bit about collectivism and what it is and more precisely, or more importantly, what the problem is with collectivism, and what we need to have, what we should take away from this concept or this ideology. Excuse me. So collectivism is the idea that you identify by the group you belong to, or that you think you belong to, that you perceive you belong to, rather than as an individual. This is the predominant paradigm in socialism and in communism. In socialism and in communism, you as an individual have no worth. There's no sense of individuality in socialism. It's all about the collective. It's all about the group you belong to. And so you either belong to the working class, or you belong to the bureaucratic class, or you belong to the oppressing class, or the bourgeoisie class. And these are the classes, and you belong to one of these groups. And depending on the group you belong to, that's your identity. And who you are as an individual doesn't count for much of anything, especially when it's actually put into practice. Maybe on paper, you can argue that that's not the case, but when it's put into practice, that is a fair assessment of socialism and communism. Whereas in capitalism and Western society, that isn't the case. Who you are as a group has almost no value. It is who you are as an individual that matters in Western society, or at least in traditional Western society. And this belief, or this view that it is the individual that matters and not the group that he or she allegedly belongs to, really comes out of Christianity. But we'll get to that in a minute. So there's a reason why, even in a Western society such as America, we would be seeing a strong trend towards collectivism. And one reason for that is because democracy incentivizes collectivism. Democracy has built into it innately, not as a feature of some design necessarily, that the designers of a country or of a nation have purposely built into it incentives towards collectivism, but democracy itself innately, inherently will tend towards collectivism. And this is why. Voting or getting someone to vote for you is a very expensive endeavor. Very expensive, both financially as well as along any other dimension you want to mention. Time, effort, all dimensions that you can think of. To get somebody to vote for you is extraordinarily expensive. And so the best way to get somebody to vote for you is by convincing them that they belong to a group who automatically votes for you. So if you can convince let's say all 30-year-old soccer moms, that 30-year-old soccer moms are a collective group, they are in a collective identity, and that identity votes for a particular party, well, then you have just garnered all the votes of the 30-year-old soccer moms, however many that is. And it's like winning a single vote. So now you don't have to go out and talk to every single 30-year-old soccer mom and convince her to vote for you based on individual preferences. But rather what you say is, you are a 30-year-old soccer mom, and 30-year-old soccer moms vote for the Mike Jackson party. And if you aren't voting for the Mike Jackson party, well, you aren't a 30-year-old soccer mom. And that would be the argument. And if I can convince the general population, including those who are not 30-year-old soccer moms, that 30-year-old soccer moms vote for the Mike Jackson party, then Mike Jackson party is going to get the vote of the 30-year-old soccer mom. And that is the hypothetical person. It's not a real individual person. It is a person that is a nominal person that represents the group. And we can do this along any dimension, any collective dimension we want to look at. So we can look at racial dimensions, we can look at language dimensions, we can look at ethnic background dimension, we can look at any possible collective and say, if I can get this collective to vote for me, well, then I'll get X number of votes. So if there are, let's say, 13 million, or let's say 60 million 30-year-old soccer moms in the U.S., and I can convince the general society that they vote for me, then I've just won 60 million votes. And so the more homogenous that collective is, the cheaper that vote becomes to obtain. It becomes cheaper to obtain. So, and this is also very advantageous for that collective, because they now have, as a collective, a certain amount of power. And the more fractured that collective identity becomes, the more power that they lose, because they're so fractured, and so they no longer have that single identity. And so now you no longer have, for instance, 30-year-old soccer moms. You have 30-year-old soccer moms who live in the suburbs as opposed to the cities. Or you have 30-year-old soccer moms who have 2 children as opposed to only 1 or 3. And so if these collective identities start fracturing, well, then they start losing their identity. So it is imperative to the leaders of that collective identity, those who represent it more vocally, those who are able to sway the collective identity towards one way or the other. Those leaders of that collective identity, it is very much in their interest to maintain that collective identity as tightly as possible and as simply as possible. They don't want there to be a very nuanced definition of that identity, because you start fracturing the identity. As soon as you start adding in further variables into the collective identity starts to fracture up. And that's why you're going to see voting blocks have a tendency to be extremely simplistic on most issues. They will not have a nuanced view of things. They will look at everything very, very simplistically and very much from along a paradigm of us versus them. And so when a collective identity or where a collective group looks at any political issue, any financial issue, any social issue in our society, they're not going to look at it and say, let's analyze this along all possible nuanced dimensions. Let's try to figure out every possible nuance about this, and then we'll come to some conclusions, because what that will result in is a very fractured identity and a diluted voting bloc. And so the leaders of that voting bloc are going to work very hard at maintaining that collective unity, and to do so, it is essential to reduce all issues down to an extraordinarily simplistic viewpoint. So if you ever listen to certain voting blocs who are parroting out a cliche viewpoint that is a caricature of reality, that is an highly oversimplified caricature of reality, and you wonder, why can't they see that things aren't that simple? Why can't they see that things aren't so two-dimensional, that there's a lot more nuance to these issues than they pretend? It's not that they can't see it. It is that there is a strong incentive to not identify that way, to not look at things that way. So they aren't going to. They are going to look at things from the most simplistic way they possibly can. Every collective identity does this. This is not picking on just 30-year-old soccer moms. This is every possible collective identity is going to do this. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a collective identity. So if the only way you analyze the world around you is by trying to perceive the full measure of its complication. Well, you're going to fracture the collective identity down to where the collective identity is an identity of a single person, of an individual, and that'll be the end result of that. So the more complexity we allow into our analysis of the world, the less possible identifying collectively becomes. So this is why you're going to find that leaders of all different voting blocks, it doesn't matter who they all are pursuing the same goals along the same path. And that path is oversimplification. That's going to be the path, because that's the path of collectivism. So you cannot, one voting block cannot look at it and say, well, you know, we're discriminated against, or we're oppressed, or we aren't getting a fair shake in the world. But that is very complicated reasons why. It's not simple. There's some historical reasons for this. There's some social reasons for this. There's some political reasons for it. There's some financial reasons for it. There's some personal reasons for it. There's some religious reasons. You know, we could look at this and we can then say, and what are the personal reasons? And then we can further see more complications in there on the personal reasons. And all of these things. But when you start looking at that, then you're opening the door, or you're opening up a tremendous amount of avenues along which disagreement can then fork out and start dividing up the group. And so what these leaders are going to do of these collective identities is like I say, they're going to try to centralize, try to focus the view, focus the sight, the perspective of the prospective collective identity, focus it all down to as narrow and as small a point as possible. That's how collectivism is going to work. And if they can accomplish that, or in so much as they're able to accomplish that, then they're going to end up with a very monolithic voting block. And so you're going to end up with certain voting blocks that vote 60, 70, 80, up to 95% the same way. And so you can look at some voting blocks and see that they vote 95% identically. They all vote the same every time, and everybody knows it, and you can count on it way ahead of time. And so that's why they would do that. Because without that, if they don't have simplistic worldviews, then they're going to fracture out, and they're going to be like other potential voting blocks that actually don't vote the same. So, you know, we can think, well, is there a 30-year-old soccer mom who votes exactly the same? Well, yes, in that 30-year-old soccer moms have a slightly above average tendency to vote the same, but not excessively above, not so much so as that it can be taken for granted. And so you can't just take for granted that you have the 30-year-old soccer mom vote in the bag. You just can't take it for granted, because even though they might vote 53% of 30-year-old soccer moms might vote the same, that's only 53%. That means there are 47% of them who do not identify as 30-year-old soccer moms. They might be 30-year-old soccer moms, but that's not what they identify as. They might identify as something else entirely, or they might not identify as any particular group, and they may be assessing every politician individually and saying, if you want me to vote for you, you are going to have to speak to me. Now, politicians would prefer not to do that. One is, it's simply impossible for a politician to speak to every single person. Obviously, it's impossible to do it, especially if you're running for national office or for even statewide office. It's impossible to do it literally, to go and speak to every single person. But even if you're doing it through television, and you just cannot address the fears, the needs, the desires, the ambitions, the goals of every single person. A politician has only so much ground he can cover. He has only so much flexibility to his platform, and there are going to be people that are not going to be included in his vision of politics and his vision of the country. And so they're going to be excluded, and they're going to know they're excluded, and they're going to likely not want to vote for that person. Whereas if the politician can convince them that they belong to this group, they belong to this collective identity, well, they're going to vote for that politician even if he does not address their issues, because they have subjugated their issues, their personal, individual issues, to the group issues. And if a politician can get you to subjugate your personal viewpoint, your personal perspective, your personal issues, subjugate those to the collective interest, the greater good of your collective identity, well, then he's got your vote. And this is why you'll have politicians say that if you belong to this particular collective identity, you're obviously going to vote for us. They take it for granted, and you may be offended at that, but they're right. They can actually take that for granted. The pollsters take it for granted. Everybody knows that every particular collective identity, in so much as it is a strong collective identity, it is going to vote homogeneously for their candidate. Even if that candidate or that party has not done anything for them personally, is never going to do anything for them personally, they're still going to vote that way. And that's because it's their collective identity. Now, you can look at that and say, that's terrible. And I think it's terrible. But it's only terrible if individuality is superior to collectivism. If collectivism is better than individuality, then it's not terrible. That's what we should all be doing then. So the real question becomes, what matters more? You as an individual, or you as a collective identity? Now, most people, when asked that, or at least most Americans when asked that, will almost certainly reply, well, me as an individual, that's what matters. But while they say that, and while I'm sure they mean it with all good intention, if they don't actually assess the political candidates, the political parties, the political positions for themselves, and if there's not an actual significant splitting of the vote, well, then that means that they're just paying lip service to the individual identity. So you can't, a collective identity can't say, well, we believe in individuality, if they're voting 80% the same way. That's just paying lip service to it, because these people who belong to these collective identities, they do not actually agree to 80%. They are not actually in 80% agreement or 90% agreement. They're probably not even in 53% agreement with each other. So how do you get people who disagree on everything to vote all the same way? Collective identity. So that's how that works. And that's why all politicians, this isn't a left thing or a right thing. This isn't a liberal thing or conservative thing or Republican thing or Democratic thing. This isn't a Christian thing or an atheist thing. This is all groups. All groups want you to subjugate your individuality for the collectivist mindset or the collectivist paradigm, because that makes garnering your support much cheaper, much less expensive. And the corresponding benefit to you for adopting that collectivist identity, even at the price of sacrificing your individual identity, is that you then become part of a very powerful lobby, a very powerful voting bloc, which is what a lobby is. I know a lot of people are always talking bad about lobbyists and these lobbyists, but you understand that voting blocs are simply lobbyists. I mean, in every practical way, there's no real difference between lobbyists and collectivists who have a very strong unified voting bloc. They're essentially the same thing. And so the advantage to you sacrificing your individual identity to become a collectivist and join a collective group, voting and reacting and thinking and speaking the party line of your group, is that you then achieve a tremendous amount of political capital as a group. Now, again, the flip side of that, the drawback, the disadvantage then again of the collectivism is that you lose all individual power. You as an individual become much less valuable. And in so much as you relinquish your individuality to the collective interests of your group identity, in so much as you do that, you devalue your individual identity. So these are the trade-offs that you have to do. And this is not to say that one is evil and one is good, or one is bad and one is good, or one is wrong and one is right. That is not the same thing. We have to look at these things dispassionately and realize that there is objective reasons why collectivism would exist, and there are advantages to it that should not be ignored. You're never going to be able to understand things if you are consistently and constantly diminishing them, being disdainful of them in your mind. You have to look at them and realize where the strengths of these things come from. Collectivism does not exist because it is ridiculous or because it is without base or without profit or gain. There's tremendous advantages to the collectivist mindset, but it also has some tremendous disadvantages. And everybody has to look at it, and they have to assess for themselves whether the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. But the disadvantage is that you sacrifice your individual power, your individual identity. And the more you become collectivized, the less you are an individual. So those are the advantages and disadvantages and why a collective identity is going to exist. And our politicians, all of them, are going to continue to try to push us to collective identities. That's what they're going to do, because that is the very best thing for them. Now, I personally believe that the disadvantages of collectivism far outweigh the small advantages there are. And I think that I would rather have less political power, let's say, overall, but more individual meaning or more individual value. That's what I personally prefer. I choose individual value over collective power. But you have to make your choices. Now, there's another disadvantage to adopting a collective identity. And that is that when you adopt a collective identity, you are begging to be judged by the performance of the whole of your collective. So if you identify as a 30-year-old soccer mom, then what you're doing is you are begging for society, all of society, the political aspect of society, the social aspect, the financial aspect, everybody. You are begging to be judged by the performance and by the characteristics that are common to that group, that are stereotypical. Because no matter how, like we said, no matter how unified that collective group is in their voice and what they project what they purport to be through their claims to the world, they actually are not that unified. So we can take groups that are incredibly homogeneous and look at those groups and realize that even though they project a nearly complete or total unity, that when we start examining the individuals of that group, we find that they hold very unique and personal views and beliefs, and they are not actually nearly as unified as they purport themselves to be. That's where many stereotypes come from. So these stereotypes then develop around this group. So you'll have a 30-year-old soccer mom, and the stereotype of the 30-year-old soccer mom is that she's driving a minivan. Now, how many 30-year-old soccer moms actually drive a minivan? Well, not nearly as many as the stereotype would lend itself to. But every 30-year-old soccer mom who comes out and says, I'm a 30-year-old soccer mom, they are going to be, and they are begging to be, judged by society that they drive a minivan. That is how they are going to be perceived, because that is the stereotype. And then they can say, well, why would you think that I drive a minivan? Well, it's because you've identified with a collective identity that is stereotyped that way. Now, if you don't want to be judged by their performance and by the stereotypes of a collective identity, then you need to not identify collectively. You need to put yourself in a category or put yourself on a footing that demands and forces people who interact with you to assess you along your personal dimensions. And the more you can put yourself in that place, on that footing, the more people are going to have to deal with you and account for you as an individual force. The more you parrot a party line, the more you repeat party mantras, the more you call yourself part of a group, whether it be a racial group, an ethnic group, whether it be a religious group, whether it be an intellectual group. It doesn't matter what that group is. The more you say you are this group, I am this kind of a person, then you will be judged and you will be categorized and you will be put in bins according to that. And so if a particular group is seen to be uneducated and you call yourself part of that group, then you will be considered uneducated off the bat. That will be the first impression everybody has of you. If you say you belong to a group that is predominantly violent, or that is predominantly peaceful, or that is predominantly stingy, or that is predominantly, or at least perceived these ways, predominantly generous, then that is going to be projected onto you when you make yourself part of that group. If you want to be assessed, if you want to be judged by your individual potential and accomplishments, then you have to eschew collective identity. You can't have it both ways. They've done studies that show that when employers go through and sort through applications for jobs that have no racial indication. So the application doesn't have a picture and it doesn't have what race or what skin color or what ethnicity or what ethnic background each person comes from, and all you can see is what they have done in life and what their name is. That employers will change, have a dramatically different response to people that have names that indicate they belong to certain collective identities as opposed to others. And this is true across many collective identities. And so if you have a candidate that has a name that is very singular and very typical of certain collective identities, they are going to either be viewed better or worse, depending on what that collective identity is, by the employers. And so we all are willing to prejudge, to be prejudiced towards collective identities. We all are. Anyone who says they're not is not facing up to the fact. But you can't sit there and cry that you are being discriminated against or you are being judged beforehand, prejudiced against for your collective identity when you're putting yourself in that identity yourself. If you don't want that, then you need to go above and beyond to differentiate yourself, to distance yourself from all forms of collectivism and embrace raw individuality. Now, that will come with certain costs. As I said, there are benefits to being part of a club. Whatever type of club that may be, there are strong benefits to being part of a club. And this is why we join clubs, and this is why we pool our resources together. But one of the disadvantages is if you belong to the 30-year-old soccer mom club and all of a sudden we get an outbreak of 30-year-old soccer moms doing horrible things, then every 30-year-old soccer mom is going to be looked at as potentially someone who does terrible things. Let's say that all serial killers turned out to be 30-year-old soccer moms. Well, that would make everybody suspicious of 30-year-old soccer moms, even though most 30-year-old soccer moms are not serial killers. That's how stereotypes and prejudices basically work for the most part. And so you have to weigh these things and decide which group, or which identity you are willing to pay the price for. Reduced social power, increased individual value, or reduced individual value and increased social power. That is the balancing act that we have to do when we are associating ourselves as collectives, as groups, whether those groups be very small, whether they be very large, whether they be social, political, religious, doesn't matter. Which leads me now to this last thing, which we started with, which is the collective identity of Christians. Now, many Christian denominations are collectivists. They collectivize the identity of their group into what we might call a denomination. That may be a formal denomination, such as the Southern Baptists or the United Methodists or one of these type of things, the Roman Catholics. These are all formal denominations which they have grouped themselves under. And so when we think of Catholics, then we think of a certain collective identity. They have a lot of kids. The priests probably can't be trusted. Now, none of these things are true about the majority of Roman Catholics, but that's the price you pay for the collectivist power. But biblical Christianity is not a collectivist identity. And this is very important to understand. In biblical Christianity, we do not identify with the group. We are not Christians because there is a Christian collective that we belong to. We do not belong to a group. Biblical Christianity is identifying individually with Jesus Christ. This is why Christians, Bible-believing Christians, speak incessantly about having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and that there is no collective relationship with God. That you cannot be a Christian because your family's a Christian. You cannot be a Christian because all your antecedents are Christians. You're not a Christian because you live in a Christian home or because you grew up in a Christian home. You're not a Christian because you live in a Christian city or a Christian nation. Bible-believing Christians understand that you are individually a Christian, individually accountable and judged by God by the works that you have done, not by the works that your group has done. And that you do not answer for, and you do not gain any traction from anything your group, quote unquote, what people think might be your group, ascribe to. Now, this is important as Christians as we look at the world around us. We should not be judging politics based on what we think our collective identity is. We need to look at things and we need to think for ourselves. We do not need to look at things and say, well, this is how fundamentalist, Bible-thumping Christians vote. This is how fundamentalist Christians do business. This is how fundamentalist Christians do church. No, we need to each act in accordance to our own conscience, because Christianity is not a collectivist religion. Christianity is an individual interaction with God in our spirit, mediated by no man, approved under the auspices of anybody. We speak to God directly. We enter into the throne of grace directly. We have a direct relationship with Jesus Christ. This is partially what the Apostle John was talking about when he said, you don't need for any man to teach you. What he is telling them is they have personal experience with God. They have a personal epistemological experience with God that requires the mediation, the arbitration of nobody. That is the essence of individuality and the antithesis of collectivism. So you shouldn't view Christianity as your collective identity. Christianity is something that people ascribe to us. Christians did not call themselves Christians. They were called Christians because they spoke of Christ. And the world was looking to find some way to collectivize them. But what Christians actually were telling people is, you can know Jesus, and Jesus can know you. Jesus said that you would enter into communion with God, and God would be in communion with you. He says that if you came to Christ, he would enter in and make his abode in you. It is individual. Jesus says he stands at the door and he knocks. And if any man will open, he will enter in and sup with him and that man with him. Notice this individual relationship, this individual invitation. There is no collective invitation in the gospel. While it's for all people of all nations, each one is dealt with on an individual level. And that's why Christianity has been historically, or I should say that is why Christians, people who believe in Jesus Christ and have this individual relationship with him, have historically resisted all forms of collectivism, including socialism, racism, slavery, all forms. These are all forms of collectivism. And you cannot solve the collectivist problem by instituting further collectivism. The only solution to collectivism is individuality. The only solution to sin, which is another form of collectivism in many ways, is the individual relationship with Jesus Christ. Remember, this Saturday at 9 a.m., we're going to be talking with Brett Carpenter about the rapture and about the second coming, eschatology in general. I hope you'll be here with us live Saturday at 9 a.m. I'm Mike Jackson, and this is the Freeborn Podcast.